I've been writing about trust and artificial intelligence for a while, particularly as it pertains to artificial intelligence as a data science product that involves machine learning, big data, statistical regression and analysis and things like that. More recently, however, I've been focusing on artificial intelligence as a particular kind of technology that requires a particular kind of trust. So let me tell you a little bit about that, because it's very related to the way in which I think we should trust, or more likely distrust, artificial intelligence. In a couple of papers that I published this last year, I make the case that artificial intelligence is a specific kind of technology. What kind of technology? Well, the first thing to know is that there's a distinction between technologies that help us with physical activities like pushing, like pulling, like lifting. So a bulldozer helps us demolish buildings, helps us carry heavy stuff. And so these kinds of technologies target our physical abilities. Other technologies that target our intellectual abilities, our mental abilities, what I call our epistemic abilities, our abilities that are geared towards gathering knowledge, storing knowledge, or even manipulating knowledge-related things. Now that we know that distinction, we can say, well, artificial intelligence is more on the side of a calculator than it is on the side of a bulldozer. That means that artificial intelligence is the kind of technology that seeks to target our epistemic abilities, our abilities to gather knowledge. When I say seeks to target, I mean it's designed, deployed, and developed to help us enhance epistemic abilities, right? Help us enhance our abilities to gather knowledge, to analyze the knowledge that we've acquired, etc., etc. And so in that first paper, which is called Artificial Intelligence as an Epistemic Technology, I make the case that artificial intelligence is an epistemic technology in virtue of three things. First of all, we deploy it, we use it, and we develop it for use in epistemic context, like inquiry in a laboratory, like inquiry into a data set. We seek to use it for extracting knowledge, such as patterns in a data set, to answer questions, etc., etc. So we use it, we design it, and we develop it in an epistemic context. Second, we manipulate what I call epistemic content. That means while the bulldozer deals and manipulates with physical matter like dirt, like heavy iron and things like that, artificial intelligence doesn't do that. It deals with something more abstract, namely data. The third thing that artificial intelligence does is that when it deals with this epistemic content, it does it through epistemic operations. What do I mean by epistemic operations? Well, I mean the kinds of manipulations that are associated with knowledge gathering. So, for example, it analyzes, it predicts, it makes inferences, it is deployed in a similar way with which we deploy our mind when we are trying to solve a problem, right? So in that sense, artificial intelligence is an epistemic technology because it is designed, developed, and deployed for epistemic context, to deal with epistemic content, and to do so through epistemic operations. Now, that's just the starting point, right? That's where we establish what artificial intelligence is. On the second paper, which is called What Kind of Trust Does Artificial Intelligence Deserve, if any? I try to make the case that because artificial intelligence is an epistemic technology, then there's a specific kind of trust that we should allocate to it. Now, let me just elaborate a little bit on that. It turns out that trust is not just one thing. There are different kinds of trust, and those trusts are usually allocated depending on the capacities of the thing we're trusting. So think about this. When I trust my friend as a friend to be loyal to me, that doesn't mean that I trust my friend necessarily, let's say, as a plumber, unless they are a plumber. Even if I trust a friend very well to be loyal to me, doesn't mean that I necessarily trust them as a doctor, a surgeon, for example. It would be wrong of me if my friend was not a surgeon for me to say, hey, I want my friend to do surgery on me because he's my friend and I trust him. No, you trust people depending on their capacities. Similarly, when it comes to technology, you don't want your car to be in charge of calculating. You don't want your calculator to be in charge of demolishing a building. You trust the technology for what it was meant to do, for it was designed, developed, and deployed to do. Okay, so now consider this, right? There's specific kinds of trust, and then there's specific kinds of artifacts. And those trusts are supposed to be allocating depending on the kinds of artifacts that we're dealing with. We just said that artificial intelligence is an epistemic technology. And it just so happens that there's a kind of trust called epistemic trust that we allocate in virtue of two things. First, we allocate epistemic trust to things, artifacts, or people in virtue of the capacity to carry out tasks that have to do with knowledge. Second, this kind of trust emerges when we have good epistemic reasons, that means good knowledge-based reasons to allocate this kind of trust. So in this second paper, I said, well, if artificial intelligence is an epistemic technology, then the one kind of trust that it deserves is epistemic trust. Remember that you don't want to misallocate your trust, right? You don't want to be confused. I don't want to trust a toddler to drive a car. Because of course I could trust a toddler to drive a car, I shouldn't, right? This is an instance in which I'm misallocating my trust. Why? Well, because I am giving the trust to a thing or a person, regardless of what they can do, are supposed to do, or were meant to do. Okay, so now what does that have to do with what I'm trying to tell you today? Well, I want to argue that we have no good reason yet to trust artificial intelligence epistemically. So now let me backtrack a bit and just kind of revisit what we did, right? So we have a epistemic technology that should be trusted only with epistemic trust, but that doesn't answer the question of whether we should in fact trust AI, either epistemically or otherwise, right? The only thing that it tells you is like, this is a kind of technology of this type, and this type of technology should only be allocated this kind of trust. That's it. It doesn't tell you whether, oh, therefore you should trust it. We just know what kind of trust we should be using. We don't know if this thing already deserves the trust that we just identified. Okay, so now, what's the answer to that? Should we trust artificial intelligence? Well, my point is that no. We shouldn't trust artificial intelligence to do any kind of knowledge-based tasks. There's many reasons why. One of them that I can give you is because it's opaque. There's no way for us to really look under the hood and see how it is that some of these methods arrive at their results. Not only that, for me it's more important not only that we don't know exactly how it works, but we don't know exactly when it doesn't work and why it doesn't work when it doesn't work. So if I look in under the hood after there's been an error, there's no way for me to find that error and then fix that error. That's one of the problems. The second one is the kind of error that these technologies are prone to. In the literature, it's called either strange error or what I call catastrophic error. And this is the kind of error that is just so far off from what anybody would expect. Let me give you a quick example. If you give artificial intelligence a task to analyze a series of pictures and tell you whether the picture includes a car, a parrot, or a guitar. You might think that a toddler, for example, as is learning concepts and language, might mistake two different kinds of technology that are artifacts and mistake the guitar for a car. But they wouldn't mistake the bird for either of those two things, right? Because two things are more like each other than the other one. An animal is not like a car, an animal is not like a guitar. And of course, even if the guitar is not like a car, they're both kind of artifacts, whereas the bird is not. Now, for artificial intelligence, the kinds of errors that it does, it can very easily, in virtue of an hallucination or in virtue of an error, mistake the bird for a car with equal degree of confidence. And now, that's the kind of mistake that is really, really hard to grasp, right? Let me tell you another reason why we shouldn't trust AI. And again, I'm going to be using image examples. When it's analyzing an image, it picks up on details that are almost nothing that resembles the kinds of details that we would have picked up to identify an object. So if I'm looking at a picture of a dog or several dogs and I need to identify whether this is a dog or a wolf, one of the things that I would look at as a human being would be the wolf or the dog itself, right? I would look at its fur, I would look at its snout, I would look at its ears, its eyes, all of those things. If you give the same task to a deep neural network or some sort of artificial intelligence methodology, it doesn't look at that at all. An instance that we've been able to kind of see what the artificial intelligence was looking at, what the method was trying to extract from, what kind of patterns it was looking at, turns out that it was looking completely at the background in the image, right? So if there is a white background, meaning less pixel variation, then it would say this is a wolf. Why do you think that is? Well, because wolves are usually photographed in the snow, whereas dogs are usually photographed at home. And so there's more pixel variation for dogs and way less picture variation for wolves in the background because snow is white and white pixels next to white pixels are less mathematically different from one another. So again, I'm just trying to kind of signal how different it is that these methods are from our own kind of perceptive abilities. Now, why else shouldn't we trust artificial intelligence? Maybe we shouldn't trust artificial intelligence because they're a brand new technology. This is a technology that's been around at the most for less than 50 years, right? Even though the idea of artificially intelligent machines has been around for a little bit more than 70 years since Turing wrote about it, the actual technology has only been around very recently, even if things like neural networks were thought of somewhere in the 80s, so like 40 years ago, the computing power and the data power wasn't there for it to be actually executed. And even if that was the case, 40 years is not a lot in the history of technology, but it hasn't been 40 years. Especially the new kind of artificial intelligence, like large language models, like generative pre-trained transformers are brand new. They're been around for at the most 10 years. Now, in order to use a technology that's so new in a context like science, we have to do many tests. And let me give you a quick example. So a lot of people think about scientific instruments and the trust that we have in scientific instruments, and they think of something like the telescope. The telescope is the sort of paradigmatic scientific instrument. We trust it, it's been around for a long time. Galileo was one of the first people to develop one that was a little bit more serious than the one that was developed in the Netherlands. We had Kepler using them. It's been associated with a very established science like astronomy. And so we think of the telescope as something that is very reliable, very much a scientific instrument. Well, if you really look at the history of the telescope, it wasn't immediately a trusted instrument. In fact, after it was invented in the Netherlands, people didn't really know how to use it or whether it was developed in an appropriate sense. Galileo comes around, he says, you know what? Actually, I know what that instrument may look like. I'm going to do a little bit of research into mathematics, of optics, and I'm going to build my own. He builds his own and then he says, my instrument is a little bit more reliable than the Dutch instrument because I have theory behind it. I didn't just build it accidentally by putting two lenses together opposite to one another. I didn't just stumble upon this. I thought about it really hard. I know the principles, I know the math, and then I build it. So mine is more reliable. But that was not enough. When Galileo tried to convince others about the prowess of his instrument and how reliable it was, people laughed at him. They couldn't really see through it. And not only that, even when they did see things, it was really hard for them to corroborate the findings that Galileo had already published. So then what happens? Well, Kepler gets involved, right? He writes a letter to Galileo, says, hey, can I borrow one of your telescopes? Galileo says, no, I only have a few. I reserve them for some of my patrons, etc. Okay, so Kepler borrows one from a friend and establishes a procedure to corroborate Galileo's findings. And what he does is he invites a lot of people over at night, people of high social status and standing, and tells them how to use the instrument. And then he makes them, each one of those people that were that night, go into a dark room, draw something independently from one another, and then at the end, he turns on the lights. I guess, you know, there's no switches over there, so it turns on the candles, lights up the candles, and then compares what each one of those people have drawn after seeing through Galileo's telescope. And in that sense, he says, well, now we can say that Galileo's telescope is a little bit more reliable than others, because not only did Galileo make it in virtue of theoretical principles in mathematics and optics, but I just ran a blind experiment with people of high credibility in which they saw similar things to what Galileo had seen. And now you might think, okay, now it's established, right? So Galileo talks about theory and principle. Kepler conducts an empirical experiment with people of high status to corroborate Galileo's findings. You might think, that's it. How more scientific can it get? But it turns out that was not enough. It took a long time to settle debates about what was really out there in the sky, in particular in relationship to Saturn. It was really hard to know what was going around Saturn. It didn't look like just like a round sphere, right? It had little ears around it. People didn't know exactly what it was. No single telescope could tell us precisely what it was. So again, it took a few decades until a few people got together, established an academy, and decided, let's not just test the telescopes to see which one is the best one. Let's throw lots and lots of money to come up with the best possible test for testing the telescope, and then we can know whether this is a reliable instrument and which one is the most reliable of all. And so what they did is establish an academy, the Academy del Cimento, and Prince Leopold from Florence threw lots of money. And again, the one thing that they did wasn't just testing telescopes. They standardized the way by which you had to test the telescopes, but they also started testing the test, because some of them were flawed, right? So they would start from one hill to the other and have a text open and one person looking, and then they would say, hey, can you read the text? But it turns out that the text was very well known. It was Dante's Inferno. It was a poem that everybody knew, so you could guess it even if the telescope wasn't that good. Okay, they had to change that and put some random letters in there. Okay, what else? Well, it turns out that the kind of paper that they were using would cast shadow with certain light, and so you could guess the letters just by looking at the shadow. Again, they had to design a different font, design a different kind of paper, etc., etc. So mathematicians, paper makers, lens crafters, all of those people got together, lots of money was thrown into the problem, and then, and only then, was the telescope established as a scientific instrument. So you might think that my position regarding artificial intelligence and mistrusting, seriously mistrusting artificial intelligence, is more about Luddite and negative position. But in fact, it's the opposite. What I'm advocating for is like, let's throw some more money at artificial intelligence, and particularly, let's throw a lot of money at testing it. And not only just testing it, but testing the test with which we test artificial intelligence. Because that is the kind of problem, that is the kind of obstacle, that is the kind of trials and tribulations that we should wish upon every single one of our possibly scientific instruments. So again, you should mistrust AI, but you should do it properly. You should mistrust AI, but let's do it systematically. We should mistrust AI, but let's do it in a way in which we actually learn something.